So welcome everyone to the second main stage panel of day one of the Responsible AI Forum. As Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Artificial Intelligence, I can tell you firsthand how much work and preparation has gone in to this event that we are starting here today, and the exciting discussions we've already been a part of and will continue to be a part of for the next couple of days. I really want to thank the whole IEAI staff, as well as our director, Lütge, and the conference staff at Interplan for working round the clock to convert this whole thing to a virtual forum in the last 7 days. So we're finally here and I'm very excited. Before we start with our amazing panel, I just want to again take a moment to ask you all to make this event as interactive as possible, include the conference's designated hashtags seen here on the screen. For all your event-related tweets and share quotes, insights, highlights, photos of your experience this week. And we look forward to seeing what you all have to say. Whoops, I'm gonna stop my screen and keep it. So now we are here to discuss this incredibly pressing issue of diversity and inclusiveness in responsible AI. From the start, we knew that this topic needed to be front and center at the forum. Having it on day one would help us set the stage for literally every discussion that will follow, because it relates to every discussion, or should relate to every discussion we're having this week. We will hear from experts this afternoon that will help us think about how bias, fairness, and ultimately trustworthiness in AI system depends on us thinking critically about who we are including in the discussions of AI use and development, and where the data that trains AI systems is coming from. This involves thinking about diversity in representation, consultation, data use in terms of regional inclusion, gender inclusion, race, age, LGBTQ, disability-related inclusion, and a variety of other factors. Concerns about AI reinforcing bias have been discussed in the context of facial recognition technologies, policing, hiring and credit algorithms, just to name a few. The pervasiveness of these tools and the far reach of their impacts means that thinking about issues of diversity and inclusion in the entire AI development pipeline matters not as an afterthought, but needs to be ingrained in the development process. Just looking at the issue of gender, for instance, in 2021, the OECD AI Index report found that more than 80% of AI professors and PhD graduates in computer science are men. Major tech companies are employing embarrassingly low percentages of women and Black workers. The proportion of women in tech-related jobs has actually declined in many places since the 1990s. If the populations being underrepresented or misrepresented by AI are not even present in the discussion when AI is developed, it's easy to see how these concerns may not be reflected in the products or the tools themselves. So one fundamental aspect we'll hear about today is making an effort to improve the diversity among those working in the field of AI early on. By improving diversity among those developing AI tools, we can create a diversity in the perspectives of those who are able to question early on the biased impacts of the tools being created. Secondly, we have problems with lack of use or access to data that would improve fairness, effectiveness, and representativeness in AI-enabled tools. We'll hear about examples of this in terms of skin color and related ML algorithms, as well as the case with people with disabilities. Moreover, as we think about diversity in AI use, social context matters as to whether and how AI tools may be used. While the global south is and will be heavily impacted by the use of AI, the vast majority of development and governance around AI is being done by the global north. What is acceptable, useful, or impactful depends on who is using the product. Without considering the issues of context, inclusion, and representation in AI development, the uptake and positive impact of AI in practice is limited because creating really trustworthy systems will be impossible. So our experts today are going to expand upon all these things I very quickly touched upon with their experiences and insights. Let's get started. I want to start with Celia Cintas. She's a research scientist at IBM Research Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. She's a member of the AI science team at the Kenya lab, and her research focuses on improvement of machine learning techniques to address challenges on global health in developing countries and exploring subset scanning and anomaly detection under generative models. Celia, we're looking forward to seeing what you see as key issues or challenges in improving diversity inclusion in AI and development.
Great, thank you so much for the intro and for the invitation. I want to take just a few minutes to share with you our current research projects around how can we evaluate the skin tone representation in machine learning datasets, and also academic materials that are being used to train our future dermatologists. So as in another medical fields, we can find disparities in dermatology space. For example, in African American populations, melanoma is often diagnosed at an advanced stage, and survival rates for ALM are 5% higher for Caucasian populations compared to African American. Currently, due to COVID, dermatologists started a registry to be able to catalog skin manifestation of these and other conditions. As you can imagine, these manifestations will vary across different skin tones. Sadly, at the moment, they report that most of the examples are from Caucasian populations and only a few from African and Latin patients. So these are some examples on how the lack of diversity impacts both professional and general public at the time of diagnosis and treatment. Of course, this is already known by people in the health domain, and they are working on materials such as Mind the Gap from Malone Mukwende that reports different clinical signs in darker skin tones. Nonetheless, it's very important that we assess the current state. So when we build machine learning solutions, we don't translate and exacerbate these type of disparities. And furthermore, looking at what we can do now is how from our technical backgrounds, we can help visualize these biases and lack of diversity across domains. So from our first work, I will jump straightly to some interesting insights. So this work was presented at MICAI by Tim and Newton, and what we actually analyzed was ways to extract skin tone information from public datasets that are being used to benchmark and train machine learning for models for diagnosis of melanoma and other skin conditions. What we found is that both of these distributions were heavily skewed to lighter skin tones and just a few samples on darker skin tones. So this is the type of information that we want to evaluate or audit when we are looking at machine learning models and in which populations they were trained on. Something similar that we found is when we work with dermatologists to look at academic materials, look at papers, presentations, or textbooks that are being used in the dermatology domain, and also analyze the representation there, what is the percentage. Something that we found across all textbooks and all presentations was that we always have 10% or less of images showing manifestation on darker skin tones. We think that this is a way that we can quantify and have an automatic way to be able to show this type of lack of diversity in these domains, and easily can we extend to others. Of course, this is not done alone. We are across IBM Research. We have people from Zurich Lab, Yorktown, Nairobi Lab here in Kenya. We have medical physicians, dermatologists, master's students, PhD students, engineers, and so on that make possible this type of research. I just wanted to do a quick call out. And thank you very much. I'm looking for the discussion now.
Thank you so much, Celia. I next have a short video from one of our panelists who couldn't make it today. She's a research manager at Fujitsu Laboratories of Europe Limited, where she is the leading AI ethics research activities through representing Fujitsu's involvement at the AI for People Forum, the IEAI Alliance, and the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics of Autonomous and Intelligent Systems. So Aisha Naseer had a few thoughts on the relationship between inclusion and trustworthiness. Oh, she was also just selected as one of the 100 billion women in AI ethics by the AI ethics list. So let's give a listen to her video for a minute.
I'm glad to be able to participate into this prestigious panel on a very fundamental topic of diversity and inclusiveness for responsible AI. The lack of trust is a main factor for reluctance of a broader uptake of AI. As we know that AI plays an increasingly ubiquitous role in society and businesses, it impacts on several aspects of our lives, including human rights. And these examples are quite vivid, for example, the facial recognition technologies. Hence, we do need confidence that AI's decisions are trusted, that they are fair, reliable, and explainable. And in doing so, we need to understand how can we measure and mitigate the discrimination or bias on different phases of the machine learning and other organizational processes within the various sectors of life, such as healthcare, finance, automotive, and others. And also, it's a very important point to mention here is that it's not only about detecting the bias or identifying the bias, it's also about mitigating it and preventing it from happening in the future. How can we be more diverse? How could we be more inclusive? A fair by design, for example, an approach, which is to when you design the algorithms, when you're actually designing the machine learning processes and the pipelines, a fair by design approach or implementation enables unbiased autonomous processes for performing machine learning, model comparisons and evaluations that hold the potential to look at such issues of diversity and inclusiveness. And also we can use some causal relationships between various attributes to assess how these biases actually happen. So the key features such as the data set assessment or looking at how the data is collected, how the data is processed, is it the in-processing or the pre-processing or post-processing, what sort of techniques are used to look at those discriminatory aspects, and what constraints can be implemented. What sort of constraints can we implement on the machine learning models to make them less biased, for example, and what sort of fairness criteria or matrices are used? We know there are so many out there, these criteria. So what sort of criteria are we using, and what sort of mitigation strategies are used? So there's always going to be a trade-off between fairness and fidelity. So how are we comparing these various models, and what sort of equilibrium point we need to achieve, what sort of trade-off we are trying to make, and what balance do we need in order to have it in a more diverse and inclusive manner. Thank you very much.
Great. So we've heard two kind of statements about a lot of the technical aspects of getting more inclusiveness and more diversity into our AI systems. I next want to turn over to Tara. She's the CEO and founder of the global tech education nonprofit Technovation. Prominently featured in the award-winning documentary Code Girls, Forbes named her as the pioneer empowering the incredible tech girls of the future. And the Discovery Science Channel named her its first CEO Science Superstar Hero for her work encouraging the next generation of innovators, problem solvers, and game changers. Since founding the organization in 2006, Technovation has welcomed more than 130,000 children and parents and 14,000 mentors to participate in its programs in over 100 countries. So Tara, I give you the floor.
Hi, everyone. And I know, Caitlin, this has been a long journey preparing for this conference, so I'm glad we are here today virtually. It's still a connection and it's a strong one. So thank you for having me. And I just want to share a little bit about why we exist and what is the work, and primarily what are some of the key lessons that we're taking into 2022. And as Caitlin mentioned, women are underrepresented in technology, and I particularly want to share this graphic that came out earlier this year from ITU, which shows the number of women that actually know how to write a computer program across different continents, and it is less than 10%. And I think that's why we are here. And that's why Technovation exists. So, oh, sorry, going back. Can we still see my screen? Yeah, okay. And so Technovation's mission is to empower girls and families to use cutting edge technologies. 10 years ago, it was mobile. Today, it's AI, to tackle real world problems in their communities. And the best way we have found is to align the competition, which is a 12-week program to empower girls to tackle the sustainable development goals. And the key element is that they work in teams supported by a mentor from industry. And I know a lot of our industry partners actually are supporting this conference. Our connection with the tech industry is very strong because people realize how important it is to build capacity in the pipeline. So to kind of explain how the model provides value to the broader tech space, you can think of it about it as building technical capacity in underrepresented groups such as women, especially those from the global south, to bring ground data to national data sets, international data sets, and to make these data sets more representative of their concerns, their lives. And this is especially true of climate change. 40% of our girls every year create apps around climate change and collect data on the ground that is not captured by satellite data. And so that's one way in which the Technovation community is working to actually address bias in different types of data sets. And here are just some examples of the different types of problems girls tackle. You can see an app from Brazil evaluating daily pollution data, helping people with disabilities communicate using different technologies with deaf people. One of my favorite apps is this one on the bottom right, where a girl used a very low-cost jack on her phone and trained an AI model to look for lung respiratory issues just by using a stethoscope. And because her grandfather had different lung issues and was not able to access medical health or medical support. Fake news is a big thing, and as is access to information about local plant diseases. Again, many of the plant databases are have data predominantly from North America, Europe, but women are at the forefront of agriculture, especially in poorer countries, and do not have the technical training or access to knowledge. And this is why these kinds of apps are so powerful to help them thrive. And here are just some of the numbers. Over the past 15 years, we've reached roughly 350,000 participants worldwide. And the model is primarily a volunteer-run model where we have roughly 100 chapter ambassadors who are dedicated leaders in their fields. Many are researchers at institutions, and they want to bring Technovation, this technology entrepreneurship mindset, to their communities. And then they recruit mentors from industry, from academia, and together every year they support roughly 25,000 girls. And then after they finish the 12-week competition, they go in and they become an alumna and continue to stay connected. And we're now seeing roughly 5% of our mentors are returning alumni, which is something that we're very, very proud about. And just some of the stats, 76% of our alumni are pursuing STEM degrees, they're working in STEM careers. But the really powerful thing is that they continue to lead change in their communities and drive innovation, because it's such an unusual experience for a young girl to be told that she has the power to make a change in a really big problem. And just setting that high expectation is something girls do not forget. And being able to get up on stage and present to the community about a solution that the whole community would benefit from is something that is an incredible stepping stone for girls. And then they just sets them on this completely new path that they would never have considered. I just want to talk a little bit about how the curriculum is so much beyond learning how to code, and there's tons and tons and tons of AI literacy curriculum, many government mandates putting AI into the K-12 system. But as all of us know, it's so much beyond just learning the mechanics, and we emphasize on actually applying what you're learning to a real world problem. And the problem identification part and the problem solving part is the hardest part, as any entrepreneur would know, any researcher would know. And so we spend quite a bit of time helping them identify behavioral barriers, thinking about sort of ethical value-based design. And then there's a strong element of complex systems thinking. What will happen if you launch a solution or a prototype into a community? What could break? Participatory design, all of these methodologies are what we try to make sure that the girls have an experience. I will skip this and just quickly talk about how a big part of it is also capacity building with the adults. Parents are an unusual part of our program. We invite parents, especially mothers, to learn alongside the girls, because girls on their own, it's not enough to give them the knowledge. Their parents are their gatekeepers. They will direct whether they are allowed to go leave their homes to go study further, take different jobs. And so involving the mothers is a very, very important strategy for building community change. We build technical capacity amongst educators. They learn how to use AI technologies to tackle real world problems. And then, as I mentioned, we rely heavily on industry partners to serve as mentors, speakers, curriculum co-developers, and they themselves learn so much from going through this rapid prototype experience, because it's rare that you get an opportunity to tackle a real world problem in a short space of time. Lastly, I'll say is that the way we measure success is not just increased knowledge of AI or the technology, but really increased empowerment of women, which is through significant gains in resources, human capital, social capital, increased agency, increased voice in their communities, because we want to build agents of change, and then of course better health outcomes. And all of this contributes to a more resilient community, because you've increased technical capacity for underserved communities, you have connected them to different types of social capital, and most importantly, you've made the community more open-minded, because they've seen women get up on stage and show how they can innovate using AI. And so that kind of open-mindedness makes the community, by definition, more resilient. I will stop there because I know I'm probably over time and we have a lot more to share.
Thanks so much, Tara. Yeah, we'll get back to a lot of that. I next want to welcome our panelist, Susan Scott Parker. She's founder of the world's first business disability network, now Business Disability Forum of the UK, and its technology task force. She leads the global campaign addressing the fast-growing risk to the life chances of persons with disabilities generated by AI-powered recruitment tools and by the HR tech phenomenon more widely. Susan, what are we missing already in the development of the discussion about AI and inclusion? Specifically, what are the unacceptable risks to life chances of hundreds of millions of people with disabilities triggered by the use of AI-powered recruitment technologies?
You grabbed my first line. That's where I was going to start, is just to say that for some reason, the need for fair, ethical, and responsible treatment of the world's more than 1.3 billion persons with disabilities just isn't on this responsible AI agenda. So I was very pleased to be invited to join you today. What we see is that neither the AI developers nor the organizations that buy and or deploy these tools, despite all the talk about bias, are asking about disability bias, nor are they discussing the disability discrimination triggered by how they're used. In fact, disabled people are so missing from this debate that no one has even noticed they aren't there. And this, despite the data, 15 to 20% of the world's population will have a disability. At least 1 in 3 people aged 50 to 64 will have a disability, regardless of, say, ethnicity. 1 in 5 women will have a disability. A fact that somehow never features in discussion about gender bias in the data. And if we live to be 70, well, we're all likely to have 10 years of disability. Yet, if we look at the thousands of AI-powered recruitment and assessment tools now on the market, neither their content, their usability, their accessibility, nor their accuracy has been validated for job seekers or employees with disabilities. Nor are they required to learn how to make the adjustments or accommodations which make equality possible for persons with disability. Inclusion is impossible if equality hasn't first been addressed. Consider the video interviews that use AI to assess your personality from your eye contact, your facial expressions, word choice, voice pattern, nonverbal communications, to compare with those of their successful or ideal employees. Just imagine your chances if you're a candidate whose disability means you cannot smile, or you have a facial disfigurement and the technology doesn't think you have a face, or you have an unusual voice pattern and intonation due to hearing loss, or you stammer and just take too long to answer and the robot cuts you off, or your skin tones are non-standard due to albinism or birthmarks or scars, or you don't make eye contact because, well, you can't. And then we have my favorite, the virtual reality test that drops candidates into an ancient Egyptian tomb to test their problem-solving skills as they walk out, and which was never asked what happens to a wheelchair user's score when she watches herself walk for the first time ever. I mean, just imagine. Well, I would urge everyone here today to check out the research from the Bavarian broadcaster BR, showing that a candidate's personality scores can change up and down from 10 to 20 points just by putting on a headscarf or placing a painting in view of the camera. And just imagine the impact on your scores and your level of neuroticism or conscientiousness if the camera saw your non-standard arthritic hands, or the crutches by your chair, or the wheelchair, or recorded your whisper. I want to stress that these AI tools do not just reinforce the economic and social exclusion of people with disabilities. Far from it. Many, many others already disadvantaged in any job market are also at risk. However, we know that systems that work for extreme users work better for everyone. And we also know that challenging the alleged science behind these life-determining assessment would work to the wider good. Think of disability as the discrimination litmus test. If women and girls with disabilities can compete fairly while navigating these AI-powered processes, well, I think everyone's going to find it just that much easier. So I have 3 asks of our audience today. Help us to get disability into the worldview of those influencing these hugely important debates. Launch your personal "What About" campaign. Start with asking, what about disability whenever race and gender bias is on the table? What about the impact on women and girls with disabilities? What about on older customers? What about people who transition from being non-disabled to acquiring a disability, as millions do every year? What about involving people with disabilities, including women and girls, directly at every stage? I'm sorry, am I? Okay, I'm sorry, I could hear someone there. And join us in calling for regulators around the world to introduce consumer protection legislation, which would require developers to prove their products are safe for persons with disabilities, as named explicitly in law, before they can put them on the market. And finally, to all and any scientists with us today, we need you to challenge the quasi-science that lies beneath and around and over so many of these dubious AI-powered psychometric assessments. Please ask at every opportunity, but where's the science? What about the evidence? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Really, I think an issue we're going to come back to in a minute after we talk to our final panel member, Celina Bottino. She is project director at the Institute for Technology and Society of Rio de Janeiro. She's an expert in human rights and technology and was a researcher at the Human Rights Watch in New York and a supervisor of the Human Rights Clinic FGFV Rio. Sorry. Celina, please tell us what you think about the main issues around inclusion and diversity as it relates to AI.
Hi, Caitlin, thank you. And first of all, saying hi to all my colleagues, female colleagues of these 100% panel made with just with women, which I think is symbolic and an example for leading these discussions. So, well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where we all are. So thank you, Caitlin, for the invite and for making this possible. So as you mentioned, I'm project director at ITS, which is this research institute based in Rio, Brazil. And actually, we've been discussing the issue of AI from the perspective of inclusion for some time now, since we organized together with a network of centers and the Berkman Klein Center, the first international event focused on AI and inclusion back in 2018. Which was in Rio, with the specific purpose of bringing more than 400 researchers to a country here in the global south to start in pointing the main research questions we would have in this topic, which is all available in the Inclusion AI and Inclusion website also. Well, but before addressing the issue of AI here with the perspective of global south, it's always important to give like a few steps backwards to address, I think, 3 points that are crucial, right? And I complement, I think, what everyone before said, which is connectivity and infrastructure, data ecosystem in these countries, and education and reskilling. So there is still a significant global divide in the quality of connectivity. And considering that most AI systems and applications will be dependent on a certain type of connection, having a good internet access is crucial. And in this point, we're still lagging behind, as for example, Brazil has still a considerable amount of people that are not connected. And also, one point that illustrates the situation in school is the situation in public schools, which still do not have internet connection. And we know that AI can have many positive impacts in education, for example, and we still have the situation which schools are not connected to the internet. There had been some efforts, and we have been helping actually in this effort to bring internet to the schools, but it's still very bad quality. And when it gets there, it goes to the academic, to the administrative department and not to the students, right? So no connectivity in the schools mean no tech educational resources for the students. And this situation was very much deepened with the pandemic, since all classes went online, and for more than 1 year, actually in Brazil, I think was the country which had the schools closed for longer. And people children from public schools actually did not have access to education as a whole. So that's, I think, that shows the importance of having a connection, which is like one of the first part of the conversation. The other one is the data infrastructure necessary to feed AI, right? Because, for example, get self-driving cars, they'll have to be based and its direction on Google Maps or any other kind of these type of applications. And there are still many, the maps are not complete. For example, low-income communities in Brazil are still do not appear in the map. There is a situation specifically in a very famous neighborhood in Rio called Copacabana, which there is, you can see the streets, but right after these big buildings, there's a low-income community which does not appear in the map. So there are still areas which are still that are already excluded, and if we do not pay attention, technology will just increase this exclusion. The other point is the quality of data, because we don't have good quality data, machine readable data to develop, and that is necessary for AI systems, right? So, for example, health sector that could really profit from a good AI application, there's no data available in a machine readable format, which this impacts not only the lack of possibility of using these AI systems, but also hinders the development of local developed AI solutions. As researchers, once we're discussing that topic with some researchers, that they just don't have what to work with in the amount that is necessary, and end up having to leave and to try and find out to implement their solutions elsewhere. So that's another point. And lastly, I think is the issue of education and the need of reskilling, which I think is two points from the main umbrella of education, right? Because we see that many AI, and for example, we saw that many AI national strategies plans had a special focus on this topic, since educating population will have to be one of the priorities to develop and to make possible the uses of AI, but and also the reskilling process. So we saw that some AI national strategies were more clear on what were they planning, but it was not the case of Brazil, which just published its AI national strategies, which was not at all specific on this point, which I think is a crucial point for especially global South countries to enjoy and contribute to the debate of development AI. And just to conclude, I would say that it's, first of all, very nice to having the possibility of being here discussing these topics, as because global South countries continue to be kind of seen as the consumers and not producers of AI. And to try and change a bit of this scenario, I think it's important for these countries to be included in all these discussions, especially to bring more diversity and mitigate possible negative impacts. And again, I think these are good, and these international forums are very good opportunities to get this conversation going. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Celina. I think, I mean, all of these intros were really helpful, and you know, somewhat by design of the panel, we have like a really broad spectrum of both kind of issues we're touching on in terms of diversity for who, inclusion for who, ranging from, we heard about, you know, tools related to skin color that aren't inclusive, related to geolocation and socioeconomic status, related to gender, related to disability and other physical attributes such as that. And so I think we covered a big scope, but I think there's probably even more. And please, everyone, now that we're in kind of the discussion session, please, audience as well, use the Q&A function to give us your own comments or questions as we start the discussion now. On the other side, I think we also had a really good scope in terms of background. So we have kind of a civil society perspective, we have legal background, we have people coming from industry and kind of the tech side of research. And it made me think about the different kind of categories that a lot of these issues fit in. So one we heard about is kind of data access, technical issues. How do we make the tools work on a technical level in an inclusive way? The second is maybe some of the governance issues. Where is the governance being developed and where is it being used, and is there a matchup or a disconnect there? And also structural issues, right? So what is it in our society, in our structure, that's not allowing voices to be heard or people to get into the room? I mean, this is a big question, but where do we start? Like, what is the kind of pillar that we need to start with? Or is this a completely, I think Tara touched on this kind of multi-sector process, right? We need the parents in the room, we need the companies in the room, we need everyone in the room. If anyone has any thoughts on what's a good place to start. Go ahead, Susan. Oh, Mike.
From our perspective, we've got to put together a carefully crafted campaign, in effect, to try to even get disability into the conversation. So we're trying to understand why it's not. So that would be really helpful. But the points that we're looking at the moment is buyers beware, because if the people who purchase the technology, and I've been looking at the HR technology because it's having a huge impact. So the people who purchase it, so if they're aware of the risks, that perhaps they will push the developers to ask different questions, involve disabled people and others in the design, the thinking, and so on. We need to, of course, influence the developers, but I can't think of any way to do that other than through the buyers and through the regulators. And so encouraging that the European Union is putting regulations through which kind of work towards you have to prove your product is safe before you can put it on the market. And we're trying to alert people with disabilities to raise their voices, if you like. The problem, of course, from the perspective of a job seeker who's visually impaired and he can't make eye contact, is that he doesn't even know that AI is being used to discard him. So how does he then exercise his rights under traditional human rights or equality law? So as you say, it is complex, but we've got a very clear focus on the buyers, because if we can at least make them aware of the risks that they are entering into when they purchase some badly designed tools, well, it's a start.
Great, so awareness, I think awareness at that level, but do we also find, I mean, awareness at, maybe Celia, from your perspective, at the technical level too, of the people developing the tools and their awareness of what's going on?
Yeah, definitely. I think I think the main topic that we need to include in our development cycle is accountability and being explicit. There is already research going on, for example, datasheets paper from Gebru or AI fact sheets from Cushion team, that they give you a structure on how you can make explicit how the model was trained, what the data looks like. Did we found any bias? Which methods of mitigating was there? Trying to build a formal process so the user that is consuming this model has access to how was built. Is important to be explicit and transparent on what the model can provide, and of course what are the limitations of it. So I would say including this type of information of the cycle is very important. And I would say, of course, there is something that all the panel knows, and we need diversity at all levels. But I would say that is way more important. Inclusion is people being comfortable to raise issues. As somebody from historically marginalized groups can have already knowledge on how this technology can generate unintended consequences, but they need to feel comfortable in the organization, in the lab that they were working on, to raise this issue on. So I will say that you need a mix of both, having a diverse team, but also an inclusive work space for sure.
I think I'll add that education is a very, very powerful way to help a very large number of people develop a certain type of way of thinking. And I think we actually don't teach any type of complex systems thinking in schools. And I think the kinds of problems that we are facing now require that type of complex systems thinking, where something, you cannot just deploy a very lean methodology. It goes quite counter to, I guess, like the Silicon Valley way of deploying products, or the typical way like a technology product used to be developed at first, where maybe just reaching scale was the metric that mattered. I think now the sensibilities are different. We recognize our planet is in danger. COVID coming out of the pandemic, I think we see the structural inequalities that need to be addressed. And I think young people are asking for much more change. And the workshop that we're going to be running tomorrow is really talking about how can we empower youth to not just sort of raise their voice in dissent or become an activist, but actually build bridges. And it doesn't even take that long. I mean, we have been running Technovation for some years, and now we are seeing young women come into the workforce and continue to tackle very, very hard problems that others are not looking to tackle. And so it's the strongest investment we can make, and it requires not that much patience, just a little bit of long-term thinking.
Thanks. We're kind of moving in a bit of a random fashion through kind of the pipeline, right? We're the start of getting people trained and in the room. How do they express their voice when they're in the room? How do we make sure those who are buying the products are asking the right questions? And then, you know, a third step would be how do we make users aware maybe of how these products are influencing them or biasing them? And you know, if you've seen any interesting examples on that end of the side of things too, Susan, maybe?
Well, we're just trying to get people with disabilities into the conversation. I mean, there's work being done, say, in India on STEM for girls, but they never bring girls with disabilities into the program. They assume somehow they live in a separate planet. There's, I think there's a huge opportunity in the program that we're working on with the ILO's Global Business Disability Network called Digital in Demand, where we're trying to get away from the typical approach that says people with disabilities are trained in segregated programs, to look at the mainstream pipelines, the Cisco cybersecurity certification, the Salesforce certifications, to bring people with disabilities routinely into those pipelines so it's easier for them to get the jobs in the companies that then develop the AI or simply need people who have the digital skills. So we're seeing some interest in that kind of system change, but it's hard to capture the attention of the AI influencers. I mean, even if you look at the numbers here today, we've got 47 participants and you had what, 170 registrations. You know, even getting them to a discussion about something to tell them they should be interested is really hard to do.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe on the
I'm looking for suggestions, by the way. I wasn't giving up there. I was looking for suggestions.
yeah, I mean, one of my flip side of all this is have you seen, I mean, we heard about Tara's program, but have you seen really good examples of either tools or practices that have been working on any of these issues, whether Celina, it's bringing in, you know, regions that aren't represented as often, or on the development side or the user side?
You're not just talking to me, are you?
No, I'm sorry, I'm talking to everyone. Yes,
You're in a room, I'd be looking at you all going, you guys understand this, the technology side of it, you must have seen. Because, you know, we're looking for examples, say with disability, where people with disabilities are coming in into the early stages of the design work.
Yeah,
and some of the
right.
kind of stuff that's happening to give people in the workplace, AI tools which say, I can walk into a room and I'm blind and my phone says, there's a woman wearing a blue shirt in front of you, there are two people on the left and the door's on the right. I mean, there's some marvelous stuff. But it tends to be all about accessibility rather than actually how it's used to impact your life chances, if you like, in terms of getting jobs, promotion. The use of robots to be supervisors, where the robot deems you to be able to do 45 movements back and forth a second. And unfortunately, you're a human staff, not a robot. And so we're seeing people becoming disabled. You know, there's fascinating twists and turns to all of this. But we're still looking for allies to really get this ARA, the disability stuff, positioned in a way that takes us forward.
And I mean, we are seeing the impact of investing in young girls and how so many of them actually create apps. I think the one that I showed was about helping people with disabilities thrive. And I think because so many of them have family members or they themselves have experience. And so I think the big lesson that we have seen is addressing a lack of educational or technical capacity from a community systems point of view, and staying in a community for years builds trust, but also just gives them the tools to actually tackle the problems that they are facing, rather than us coming in and saying, oh, this is the kind of solution that you need. One of the stories that I've always remembered is that one team of girls from Guadalajara in Mexico, they created an app to help blind people navigate the public bus transportation system in Guadalajara. And I was asking, how did you come up with this idea? They're like, at our bus stop, we saw this guy standing and he had a cardboard sign with a number on it. And so they were very intrigued. So they went up to him and asked, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm blind. And the bus driver of this particular bus stops and picks me up. And so then they asked, how do you know which stop to get off on? And he says, I navigate by smell. And so the girls were so blown away that they decided that they needed to create an app to help blind people in Guadalajara navigate the public transportation system. And we see so many incredible examples like that.
That's a great example. And
yeah.
Do you think if we gave them the challenge of saying, bring 10,000 girls with disabilities into the program, bring 10,000
I think so. And we partner with,
yeah,
totally. And we partner with so many, we partner with so many organizations that reach out to different, like you were saying, people with different types of backgrounds and abilities. So but I'll let somebody else share.
Well, I'll follow up with you afterwards and let's see if we can bring some of your learning into some of the communities that we've been talking to. That would be terrific. But not now. I promise to be quiet now.
Oh, go ahead. I'd love to hear some other examples. I mean, I think that's a key example of how if we don't have an inclusiveness in even the first part of it, we don't even know what the problem is sometimes, right? Celina, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just this examples is great to show, because the importance of having this diversity whenever thinking about to try and develop solutions, right? Because there's most of the time maybe people are really not aware of these challenges and do not have the opportunity to be in close contact with people with disability to learn from them and to try and experience what they, at least part of what they, the challenges that they have, so that could together think about solutions, right? So like, I think just an example here, in Brazil, the judiciary here is leading, let's say, the use of AI in the public sector in a way. It has already some published resolutions, really much mimicking the resolutions on AI for the judiciary in Europe. But there's a specific article which says that any research group that will be developing AI tools to be used should be diverse, and then it's expressed and says all kinds of issues that are of inclusiveness, and including people with disability. It's a beginning, like it's still just on the paper, but at least that's that's the, I think, first step, and we have to see how it really goes. But I think it's fascinating how, specifically on the topic of disability, how really technology can be a really good ally, right? And tools for helping, just like Tara mentioned this example, and many others. And I think also there's another component of educating people and understanding also how to deal and to understand this in this whole world of people with disability, which there's a part of accessibility, which you mentioned, that you have all smartphones, which you can send audio messages, which it reads, right, what has been written in text, it like reads out loud for you. But these, as you mentioned, is just part of accessibility, which is a first step. But then how we go deeper, right? It's a first important step, but then how to go deeper. And if not, and I don't think how we can if we don't put people together, right? To the same place to discuss.
We have a question in our Q&A, and please keep them coming. Talking about bias in AI, is bias only coming because of the data, quantity, and quality, or also because of the development team and how they build models? If yes, what are the ways how developers might program or unprogram bias in AI besides data tech, getting better access to data? I don't know, Celia, you have a thought on this?
Yeah, sure, I can give a try. So of course, it's not only data. Data is crucial on it, and something that we usually need to remember on machine learning methods. Usually data sets are repurposed data sets, right? They were collected at one point for one reason, they made public, and then they are used as benchmarks and so on. Of course, this is a big issue, pointing out how the data was collected. If it was a survey, what was the social context of asking questions in that survey, or asking any other type of socioeconomic information. We always need to address the context on how the data was collected and what was the original purposes. Of course, if we are looking to more complex person-related data sets, you have consent in the middle. You have to inform the person if the goal has changed and stuff like that. So the data has a huge impact on it, but also there is research showing that even when models compress representation information of raw data, we can see that the model gets biased towards the representation that it learns. Of course, there are different pre-processing techniques that will probably can even reduce more the impact of small subgroups, for sure. So I would say that there are multiple parts on the pipeline, and of course there is mitigation techniques. How can you penalize the model where you're training so it doesn't remove information for smaller groups and so on? I will say that there are multiple steps. You can definitely check the AI 360 toolbox to have an idea of what a pipeline looks like, what type of pre-processing in the middle and post-processing. As Aisha mentioned, you can look at your ML pipeline when you're working on, for sure.
Great, thanks. I see another question here. Thank you very much for the insights on these important topics and projects. How do you think we can work on structural changes, empowering majority groups, white cis men, for example, on high positions in the field of AI or in general? And who's responsible for this kind of change? Any thoughts?
I can say that I think partnering with nonprofits where they are sort of changing the pipeline, and we are seeing this. I think what we are seeing, it's kind of hard for, just from thinking about young women, especially from communities of color, coming into these institutions where they are working in teams where they have probably white men as their bosses. I think we are seeing that we need to provide them with better tools to be able to navigate these situations, because it will take a few more years before the numbers are larger. Just in our own numbers, we have roughly 2,600 women now who are in the workforce, but 30,000 young women are going to be joining, graduating from college within the next 3 years. So that's the sort of scale that I think is a result of the coding movement that started roughly 10 years ago. And so the thing that we are realizing is that it's not about, it's about building bridges. And if you take up a fight, the numbers are not with you. So, and it's not enough to just walk out, because especially for women in developing countries, they may not have the financial stability to be able to do that. And so you have to make change within the system. And for that, you need a lot of patience. And if you look at women leaders in many spaces like that, that's the key thing, where they like, you make change from within. But working with the nonprofit sector, you can actually build up those ranks and drive change. So that's just something that we are seeing, where it's not just enough to have the technical capabilities, but you also have to be able to be an amazing leader.
I think I saw a quote somewhere, I forget who was talking about it, but you know, I mean, there's obviously a big effort we need to make, which your organization is working on, of getting, you know, more inclusive people, more inclusiveness into the room. But then there's like, how do you stay in the room, right? How do you not be forced or feel like you can't stay in the room anymore?
Or become disillusioned and jaded. Yeah. It's a long fight.
And I think in terms of on the development side, but also on the user side, we often talk about a lot of the ethics and the implications of these AI tools. And there's often kind of a little bit what you were saying, that there's a luxury sometimes to not having to use a technology or a tool, or to be able to say, I'm going to leave this job because I'm not being treated correctly or my voice isn't being heard. We can't make that assumption that people can just give up using a technology or can give up a job because of what's happening. And that probably disproportionately affects a lot of the groups we're talking about here, right? Who can't afford to do that. I think that's a really important point. If anyone else wanted to comment on this question, we have one more in the Q&A, but we have plenty of time. Okay. Another question we have is, or a comment, subjectivity appears to be an important factor in collecting data and writing code for AI agents. In this respect, little is known about subjectivity. Interesting. comment. I don't know if anyone has anything. Celia, maybe something to say about that.
Yeah, I think it's a shift right now on this research focus. I think for too long the idea of code development and machine learning was think as an abstract action, that it was not biased because it was a machine, and people forget about the programmer, the researcher that has their own background when building the solutions. So I think there is a lot of movement researching on this space of human-centered AI, and have more ideas around how our backgrounds impact our work. But programming is yet another human activity, so it will be subject to subjectivities and our previous backgrounds for sure. I think it's a movement that is moving towards studying more these type of impacts for sure.
I know there are some checklists out there and things that, developers can go through, but it's not as widespread as it should be. Go ahead, Susan.
Well, for me, there is one problem, of course, in terms of bias in the data, but we mustn't forget, and I was interested in what Tara was saying about the complexity of the systems that we're actually addressing, that it's how the tool is deployed, how it's conceptualized, if you like, so that classically an AI assessment in terms of recruitment, they will say things like, we've designed a standardized process so that we treat everyone exactly the same, and that removes human bias, unquote. When actually what it does is it discriminates instantly against people with disabilities who need an adjustment so that they can prove what they can do. It's like putting a set of stairs in front of Stephen Hawking's and saying, because we treat everyone exactly the same, you have to climb the stairs. So it's because they're not looking at the end-to-end system, if you like, in which the tool is deployed. And they don't understand discrimination and how it works, not just on the disability front. So it's much more than just bias in the data. We have to look at what impact is the use of that tool in that way having on, in this instance, vulnerable job seekers of whatever level of disadvantage they have, but particularly people with disabilities, because it's such a diverse range of people who then can't even apply because they can't see, hear, hold the gaming controls. Their face isn't recognized as a face or whatever.
Yeah, I think, like this, the AI has this so much potential power to actually kind of tailor and level the playing field in a lot of ways. And sometimes that's, you have maybe the right motivation, but it actually distorts things in the other way. We have about 10 more minutes. And I wanted to also move over to kind of a topic we haven't touched on yet, related to kind of how do we start and regulating and governing this AI process to make it more inclusive and diverse. And also, as I'll come back to Celina because she's a part of our global AI ethics consortium. And one of the big things is how do we set up, governing AI that's largely been dominated by the West, and does that apply everywhere in the world? And how do we make it apply to certain groups better or certain regions better? How do we bring that conversation into the fold?
Sure. Yeah, and I think there's a question from Sophia, right, on this topic of regulation and laws, which if we need already, how are you gonna tackle this issue, which I think is always a challenge when we talk about regulation of technology, as it's always like you're in the forefront of saying, well, if you regulate a lot, if you put lots of limits, then it will hinder possible innovation and possible development. So I think so for example, Brazil is, in my opinion, as I just mentioned, in April, there was published the National AI Strategy, which actually was much more like kind of an intent letter, and rather than a strategic plan setting like goals and objectives and saying, well, how much will be invested in this area? What do we want as a country from AI? How do we want to be positioned? And that was not the case. it was more kind of a letter of principles and more like abstract. But now Congress is deciding, really is discussing a bill to regulate AI, and it has already been approved in one of the houses, and now is going to be approved in the Senate, which did not have any public consultation. So I think any AI regulation and law, or any attempt to govern, should be result of a multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary process, right? You cannot have a good, let us say, a comprehensive AI law and regulation if it is not the result of this group of people, which includes the developer, the experts, people from philosophy to talk about ethics, the lawyers to talk about also the responsibilities of how liabilities, what happens if AI system create any harm, who will be responsible for that. Also, as we were mentioning here, people from different communities of color, of disabilities, how you would be subject to that. And in this point, I think there's two ways you can move forward, like using more kind of sandbox solutions of saying, well, let's do like this experiment and using kind of regulation in this sandbox environment. And also the prototyping of public policy. I think Meta is developing a called Loop, I can get the name, which it focus on trying to experiment one specific suggested legislation and put it in, really applying it and seeing the impact, right? And then whenever in partnership with other companies. So we would see in practice, well, how this specific AI regulation will be applied, and what will be the concrete effect on the real world on a specific AI application. Then based on that, there's like comments and observation, and you see, and then you can adjust and go, well, the intended legislation was to go in this way, but once it is applied, you see the results is the opposite what you were intending. So I think there's a space for that needs to be experimenting, right? Rather, it's if not to hinder and make innovation not possible, but all this process has to be really multi-stakeholder and the most inclusive as possible, just to, at the outset of any legislation, just to try and capture and mitigate potential discriminatory risks and most of the things we were discussing here.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I know in terms of the EU regulation and recommendations there, they often use this kind of, well, they deemed things as very high risk and minimal risk. And I find some of that also has kind of maybe a subjectivity to it, right? It depends on the user of that. If you, and what, as we were talking about before, like what does risk mean to you? And do you have the luxury of not getting a home loan, right? Because of some discrimination that's built into the algorithm, or having health related AI apps that don't identify you correctly. And thus, I mean, that could be a huge risk because that's your health, right? If cancer isn't caught for you because the system doesn't work for you. So how do we build, I think going along with the question Sophia mentioned, how do we build this protection against discrimination that really can have these really high ramification risks to it into how we think about regulating AI? Anyone has any thoughts on that? I think Susan touched on it a little bit with saying we need kind of a consumer test of it, the way I think in your video, which we'll post later on baby products, the same way we have on AI products and things like that.
Well, I know that at Oxford Brookes University, their Institute for Ethical AI, they're developing a tool that would, in effect, test an HR tool. So you could send it to them and they would put it through a variety of tests. There's another university that was looking at what they called a black box arrangement, where somehow you could attach a monitoring system to an AI tool. And then if it did harm people, just as pilots have a black box that captures what was really going on, they could track it back through how the algorithm was working and so on. So I know there's a lot of thought being put in here, and I was really pleased that the Institute for Ethical AI produced the first white paper on called the Recruitment AI Has a Disability Problem. Great title, loved it. And so they're starting to look at who needs to do what differently. Because as you say, Celina, it is multi-stakeholder. My worry if it's too multi-stakeholder is it'll take, I won't live long enough. I just won't live long enough for that process to come through. So we do need, I think, to be fairly clear on how we at least get the right stakeholders to ask the right questions. And what I love about Tara's work is the possibility of bringing bright people in to say, how would you make sure that this disabled person in the Middle East can get travel insurance or life insurance? Classic pattern across the Middle East that people with disabilities can't get insurance. Now, I can't imagine that whoever is developing the AI tools the insurance industry is going to use is sitting there going, oh, what about disabled people in the Middle East? So if we could just start to get the what about questions coming through, the solutions must be there. There must be. Tell me they must be.
Definitely. I think audits is the key word on testing as much as possible from multiple people. I think audits will give you what are these missing groups that are not being counting on the application development, or what are the historically marginalized groups that usually suffer for these unintended consequences, positively, negatively. I think audits is something very important. It has to be in different steps of the project or project development of machine learning for sure.
And what I'd like to see too is at the moment, as I look as an outsider at this, most of the data is people who applied and maybe got jobs, people who tried to buy things. The data never says, well, for example, Harvey told us some time ago, they'd had 9 million people try to get jobs. Well, I bet 8 million didn't get the job they asked for. So they've got all that data, but they never mine that data to see what those people who didn't get through had in common. Mm-hmm. So if they, 90%, I make this up, didn't make eye contact. I'm wondering if that's because they couldn't. But they don't know it. They never look at the data of the rejected. And so many of the rejected, of course, have no idea that AI was even involved when they were rejected, that we can't count on the individual testing the system, taking them to court or whatever. Maybe the institutions, the government of Canada has decreed that they will have access to the black box despite all the commercial confidentiality issues. If any of the AI that they purchase harms a Canadian, it's built into the contracts that they can look at the black box. So we're seeing some approaches there that actually at least capture the attention of the developers.
Yeah. So I think we've got two big votes for the importance of audits and kind of a more evidence-based kind of policymaking built off of what we can learn from all this. We have to wrap up in about 1 minute, but I want to give Celina and Tara both a chance to maybe throw their last kind of what to take away from this and where's the next step from each of you before we wrap it up.
I think I'll just go back to there's so much research showing that when you invest in girls' education, it's almost like the single most important investment you can make, because a lot of these, if you look at this panel, there are women, and probably it's by design, but there's a lot of research to back up why this is the most effective investment, long-term investment, and not even that long-term. And so I feel we've got to stop asking the question, what can we do? And actually there's plenty of data to show what needs to be done. You have to invest in the young women in your countries. Roughly I think 65 to 70% of the world's population lives in Asia and Africa. But a lot of the technologies are definitely have that Western global North element, and that can be fixed by empowering and investing in these girls. So that would be my main plug.
Awesome, agree with that. Celina, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Oh, very quickly. Well, first of all, thank you for learning. I learned a lot with everyone, and already thinking about possible partnerships and projects that we could do here in Brazil. with all of the have been said. And to just reinforce what I was saying, well, I know, Sarah, Susan, it takes long, but maybe we can start at least at some part of it, not being knowing that will be not comprehensive and will deal with any situation, but we have to get it going in. But right, in at least choose one of the first topics that should move forward, and have the what is possible, right? Also, right, to be more inclusive and multi-stakeholder as possible. And because the problem is that before there was not even an effort to make this happen, right? So now at least I think it's something on the top of the mind, and we have to be a bit more patient, but optimistic that we'll have with more women in tech, and we'll have a better future,
including women and girls with disabilities. Yes,
sure.
That would make a huge
At least
difference.
yeah.
Thank you all so much for being here. I think I'll steal, something Susan said, that I think we should try to take through the whole rest of this conference. We're almost at the end of day one, but in every session, what about? We got to ask that question whenever we're talking about any of the topics that are going to go on through the next 2 days. So all of you, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to everyone in the audience for your questions. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. We have our next parallel session coming up soon, so please stay tuned, and we'll see you back on the main stage tomorrow morning.